What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. All right, so this is a requested video. Someone wanted me to do a comparison between Bernie Bickerstaff, former NBA coach and the father of JB Bickerstaff, who was previously the head coach of the Cleveland Cavaliers, and Paul Silas, longtime NBA coach that passed away back in December of 2022. Jimmy Bickerstaff is still with us. He is a senior basketball advisor in the NBA, but he has not coached since I believe the 2012-13 season when he coached on an interim level with the Lakers. I think he might have been the coach that replaced Mike Brown when he was fired, by the Lakers shortly into that season. You may remember, I think that's the year the Lakers start off like 0-5, 0-6, and Bickerstaff, I think, replaced Mike Brown. Paul Silas hasn't coached, I believe, since sometime around that. Well, I can't say he hasn't coached since he's no longer here, but I think he last coached maybe sometime around that period too. Both these coaches have a link to a franchise, that being the Charlotte Hornets. Both coached the Charlotte Hornets. I think Paul Silas in two different stints, and Jimmy Bickerstaff coached that franchise somewhere in the middle. I think Paul Silas coached them like late 90s, early 2000s, late 2000s, early 2000 teens. And I think Jimmy Bickerstaff was in the mid 2000s. You know, when someone asks this question, like when you think about it, you're inclined to say Paul Silas, right? Well, Paul Silas, right? Because when I think of Jimmy Bickerstaff, for some reason I've always thought of him as an interim coach, but that's because I'm younger. Later on in his career, he did have some uh, interim head coach stints, but I totally forgot that Jay Bickerstaff was the coach of those Sonic teams in the late 80s and early 1990s. And he actually coached in the conference finals back in 1987 when they made it to the 87 finals against the Showtime Lakers. So unlike Paul Silas, he did coach in a conference final. With that same team made to the semifinals in 1989. I think Paul Silas, the furthest he went in the playoffs was two conference semifinal positions with the Charlotte Hornets back in 2001 and 2002. And I think those are the teams that I think they had Jamal Mashburn on those teams, Baron Davis. I think George Lynch was on those teams. George Lynch. I think he was on one of those teams, maybe the second one, because in 2001, I think he's with the Sixers. Lee Nalon, P.J. Brown, those teams. Those are the teams that Paul Silas coached, and they were pretty damn good, Who was the better coach? Paul Silas seemed to have more visibility, and he was very popular as far as with players. He was fired in the 2004-2005 season, because LeBron Ramon James was too good to try to augment his game to fit into Silas's system. He wanted LeBron to play more in the post. LeBron wants to play his way, and LeBron used his power to get Paul Silas fired. You know what I'm saying? So look, man, Paul Silas coached the then San Diego Clippers in the early 1980s, but didn't coach again in the NBA until about 15, 16 years later with the Charlotte Hornets. He had some success with them. He went to playoffs three. Let me see, one, two, three, four out of 5 years, I believe. He went to the playoffs. Missed the playoffs the first year with them. Lost in the first round the next year. Went to the conference semifinals the next 2 consecutive years, and then lost in the first round his last year with the franchise. Matter of fact, some people still wonder why he was actually fired after 2002-2003 season. They went 47-35. Now you could argue, okay, they're not really going forward, but they were a young team and they were making it in the playoffs. And it ain't like, yeah, that wasn't exactly the strongest era in the East, but they weren't the Sixers, they weren't the Nets, they weren't the Celtics, they weren't the Pistons, as they would become. They were the Hornets. But, and Paul Silas was the first coach of the Hornets team that ultimately became the New Orleans Pelicans before the Hornets did a reset and came back to Charlotte. What was that? I guess when the Bobcats became the Hornets. It's about maybe a little over 10 years ago. And then Paul Silas afterwards had a stint with the Cavaliers, but as I said, that went to kaput because of LeBron, and then he finished off his career going back to Charlotte. They might have still been the Bobcats then, if I'm not mistaken. They might have, I think they were the Bobcats, and he had a horrible final year of his coaching career. They abbreviated 2011-2012 season when they went 7-59. Bernie Bickerstaff, I would argue, coached more talent than Paul Silas. Those Sonics teams had Tom Chambers, Dale Ellis, the X-Man, Xavier McDaniel. So he had some success with them. He went to Denver. He was a coach of that team, 1994-95. I think that was after George Karl either left or got fired. I can't remember whether they got left or got fired from the Denver Nuggets. But after that season, Bernie Bickerstaff became the coach of that Denver Nugget team, the one that had Mutombo, Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, Brian Stiff, LaFonso Ellis, Nate McMillan. Who else was on those teams? Detlef Shrimp. Those teams. So, matter of fact, I do think that George Karl was fired because Jay Bickerstaff's first season, he only coached in 32 games. And then the next year, his first full season, 95-96, 35-47. I think that was Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf's finest season, the 95-96 season. That's the year also of the controversy with the national anthem, and he got blackballed by the NBA, David Stern, and he was out the league in a couple of years. And his career was just ruined. That guy should have been the Steph Curry of his generation. You know what I'm saying? Bernie Bickerstaff was fired 13 games to the 96-97 season. And then, ultimately, he became the head coach of the Washington Bullets. And remember, that team had Juwan Howard, Chris Webber, Rod Strickland, George Murison, Calbert Chaney, what's his name? Tracy Murray. That team, at the time, could have been a team of the future in the Eastern Conference, but injuries and discontent ruined that team. And after the 98-99 season, that was it for Bickerstaff. I can't remember whether he got fired or not. Probably. With the Washington Bullets / Wizards, always a coaching carousel. Then he had a stint with the Hornets. And this was after Paul Silas left. So, or was fired, I believe. So they followed each other, I think, in that role. And last time that Bickerstaff coached was a 5-game stint in the 2012-13 season when I believe he followed Mike Brown, went 4-1 in a little interim stint. Overall records, Paul Silas went 387 and 488 for a 442 win percentage. Bernie Bickerstaff went 419 and 518 for a 447 winning percentage. Paul Silas has the edge in the playoffs, 13 and 16, 448. Bickerstaff, 12 and 21 in the playoffs, 364. Now you could argue Bernie Bickerstaff went up against probably better competition, but he also coached better teams than Paul Silas. Man. Well, Bernie Bickerstaff won the Chuck Daly Lifetime Achievement Award back in 2014. Won a championship as an assistant coach with the then Bullets in 1978. He was an assistant on that team, and he was an executive with the Cleveland Cavaliers when they won a championship in 2016. Paul Silas, as far as coaching accolades are concerned, didn't really have any. Man, I guess, man, you kind of surprisingly, I guess you got to give it to Bernie Bickerstaff. You got to give it to Bernie Bickerstaff. Won a championship as an assistant coach. Had a little bit of a longer stretch in the NBA coaching. Paul Silas had like a 13-year stretch where he was, no, 15, 16-year stretch where he wasn't coaching in the much of the 80s and much of the 90s. Bickerstaff has Lifetime Achievement Award, the Chuck Daly Lifetime Achievement Award, named after the late Chuck Daly, and won a championship as an executive. That's not coaching, but that's management. I remember Bickerstaff was the coach of that then Bullets team that lost in the opening round against the Chicago Bulls in '97. Where Mike dropped 55 in one of those games. But it was a competitive 3-game series. Very competitive. You know, it wasn't your typical blowout back then, best of 5, 3-0 victory. Those games were contested, especially that last one in Washington. So one thing I'll say about Bickerstaff, I remember his teams being rather competitive. They weren't easy outs. Let's see something here. The worst season Bickerstaff had was 2004-2005 with the Hornets, 18 and 64. Paul Silas had one of the worst seasons in NBA history his last year with I think they were still the Bobcats then, 7 and 59. 7 and 59, one of the worst seasons of all times. He also had back-to-back horrible years with the Clippers in 82 and 83, 17 and 65, 25, 57. I'm going to give the edge to Bickerstaff, man. Bickerstaff went to a conference final. The Chuck Daly Lifetime Achievement Award, won a championship with assistant coach position with the Bullets in 1978. Won a championship as an executive, although it's not coaching, it's management, with the Cavaliers 2016. He coached better talent. I remember his teams not being easy outs for the most part. And, to be honest with you, Bickerstaff, oftentimes, I think, like Paul Silas, oftentimes were fired when teams got better. That's another old trick that some of these racist ass old time managers used to do, where they will hire a guy that's black during the lean years, but the minute it's like the team is on the upswing, Then they fire that coach and then hire a white coach and he gets all the praise. I'm not trying to be racist. I'm criticizing. I'm not trying to be racist saying that, but it's something that they used to do, and you could argue to an extent some of them still do that little funny trick. You know what I'm saying? Um, I'm gonna give the edge to Bickerstaff, y'all. But tell me what you guys think.